A hidden gold strike. A mountain mining camp. Men disappearing one by one. Sierra Trail. A Western thriller. Chapter 1. Third man Dewey sent for, the woman at the door said. You going to last longer than the other two? Depends on what they found, Sample said. She looked at him, the way women who have run boarding houses in hard country looked at men who arrived on tired horses asking for rooms. A complete inventory conducted in the time it took to blink, nothing missed. Opinion already forming before the handshake. She was 60 or close to it, broad across the shoulders, with a face that the mountain winters had worked on, and that had declined to be diminished by the working. She wore an apron over a wool dress, and she held the door open with one hand and made no move to open it wider. Hassie Prout, she said. Sample. You have a first name? Eldridge. I don't use it. She looked past him at the horse. The horse was a bay with good bone, and the settled manner of an animal that had covered serious ground and knew it would be asked to cover more. Put him in the shed around back. There's feed. $4 a week for the room, meals included. I don't serve whiskey, and I don't carry messages, and I don't take sides in disputes that aren't my business. She paused. Most disputes aren't my business. Most, Sample said. Most, she said, and stepped back to let him in. The boarding house smelled like pine resin and wood smoke, and the morning's bread, still present in the air at 3 in the afternoon, a warm smell that the cold came in past when Sample brought his saddlebags through the door. The front room held a table long enough for 8, a cast-iron stove doing serious work against the March cold, a shelf of books above the stove that had been read and read again by their broken spines. 2 doors off the back of the room, both closed. A staircase to the right, going up to where the rooms were. Clean. More orderly than anything else in Sierra Creek, which Sample had ridden through for 20 minutes on his way here, and had formed an accurate first opinion of. The camp occupied a creek drainage between 2 ridge systems that rose on either side of it like walls that had not yet decided whether to close. The creek ran hard with snowmelt, brown and cold, and above it on both banks the stamp mill ran its continuous percussion, the sound of it coming through the drainage like something the mountain itself was saying, not a pleasant sound, not an unpleasant one, just the fundamental fact of the place. This is what we do here. This is the sound of why we exist. Everything else is footnote. The structures along the creek answered the stamp mill's ambition with varying degrees of sincerity. The mill itself and the Consolidated's main building were solid log construction, squared corners, chinked well, built by men intending to stay. Everything else ran the range from rough-framed to canvas over poles, to one structure that appeared to be a lean-to that had given up on the lean, to concept partway through and become something harder to categorize. The single saloon had a painted sign and 2 windows, one of which had glass. The assay office had glass in both windows, and a lock on the door that was heavier than the door warranted, which told Sample something about the assay office's relationship with the camp's social order. 40 people, maybe 45, going about the business of extracting metal from a mountain in March, when the snowmelt made the creek run fast and the upper workings stayed frozen, and the mud in the low areas pulled at boots with the persistence of something that had a point to make. It smelled like all of it. The creek cold and mineral, the mud dark and organic underneath the cold, the mill smoke hanging in the drainage because the ridges on either side held the air down, and underneath all of it the pine smell of the surrounding forest pressing in from above the worked ground, reminding the camp that the trees were waiting. Sample put his horse in Hassie's shed, and came back and took his room, 2nd floor, east-facing window, a view of the ridge that the sun came over late and left early, and sat on the bed and looked at the window, and listened to the stamp mill, and let the camp arrange itself in his thinking. Dewey Fitch found him before supper. He came up the boarding house stairs without knocking on the front door, which told Sample that Hassie had been watching for him and had let him in. And he knocked on the room door with the knock of someone who had been waiting for this arrival long enough that the waiting had moved past impatience into a different register, lower and more contained. Sample opened the door. Dewey Fitch was 28 and looked 10 years further along. Not old, worked. The hands first, a placer miner's hands scarred from the sluice work, the knuckles permanently reddened from cold water, the grip when they shook hard and brief, the grip of a man who had learned that how you shook hands told people something and had decided to tell them he was still in this. He was raw-boned through the chest, an inch under 6 feet, with dark eyes under a brow that carried the permanent furrow of a man doing arithmetic he couldn't make come out right. "Dewey Fitch," he said. "I know," Sample said. "Come in." Dewey came in and looked at the room, the bed, the window, the saddlebags on the floor, and did not sit. "Marshal Giddings in Salem told me you were the man to write to. Said you'd handled something similar over in the valley." "Similar enough," Sample said. "Leland's been gone 11 weeks. He said it the way he'd said it many times, enough times that the saying had worn the emotion smooth, leaving just the fact. Territorial Marshal's office took my report in January and sent a deputy in February. Deputy spent 3 days and went home and sent me a letter that said the mountains took men and Leland knew the risks of the work." Dewey looked at the window. Leland didn't wander. He'd been on that creek for 4 years. He knew every rock in that drainage. "Tell me about the claim," Sample said. Dewey sat on the room's single chair and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "East Bank placer operation, filed in 70. We worked it together the first 2 years. Then I took a job with a freighting outfit and Leland ran it alone. Good operation, not rich but consistent. Enough to winter on and come back in spring." He rubbed one hand across the other, the unconscious motion of a man whose hands were always cold. "The Consolidated started buying up claims around us in 71. Got 4 of the 6 neighboring claims inside a year. The other 2. Ours. And Bascom Reeves, North Fork." Dewey's jaw set. "Bascom died in the fall of 72. Fell in a ravine. That's what the official record says." Dewey looked at him. "That's what the official record says," he agreed, and did not add anything to it. "After Reeves died, his widow sold to the Consolidated. Nora Reeves. She had children and no help, and the Consolidated made her an offer." Dewey's voice held no judgment about Nora Reeves. "After that, we were the last independent claim on the East Bank. Leland started getting visits. From Mabry. From Mabry first. Social calls. Friendly. Mabry he's good at friendly." Dewey looked at his hands. "Then the offers started. They went from reasonable to good to better, and Leland kept saying no, and after a while the offers stopped and the friendly did too." He paused. "Last October, Leland wrote me that he'd had a survey done. Independent man from Portland came up and spent 3 days on the claim. Leland didn't tell me what the survey found in the letter. Said he'd tell me in person when the season ended. The survey never found." Marshal's deputy looked through the cabin. Everything else was there: clothes, tools, the journal Leland kept. "No survey." "You have the Portland surveyor's name." "Man named Aldous Webb. I wrote to him in November. He wrote back saying he'd done the survey, said the results were Leland's property and he couldn't discuss them." Dewey looked up. "But he wrote back, which he didn't have to. And he said one other thing." "What?" "He said, if I had occasion to be in Portland, I should come see him in person rather than put anything further in a letter." Dewey held Sample's eyes. A man who says that is a man who thinks his mail is being read. Sample moved to the window. The drainage below held its late afternoon light badly. The ridges cut the sun off early, and the shadows came up fast from the creek, the camp going from gold to gray in the space of 20 minutes in a way that felt abrupt even when you were watching it happen. The stamp mill ran its percussion. Two men crossed the muddy street below, at the angle of men who knew where they were going and had been going there for months. "Ira Mabry," Sample said. "You want my opinion of him. I want your read on him." Dewey thought about this distinction and accepted it. He's not stupid, and he's not mean. He's practical. He does what the job requires, and the job has required some things I don't think he went looking for. He turned the distinction over. A man who works for something large enough will find himself doing what the large thing needs and calling it his own decision. Mabry's been doing that long enough, he may not know the difference anymore. That was a more precise analysis than Sample had expected from a raw-boned placer miner in a mountain camp. He looked at Dewey. Dewey caught the look. "Leland was the smart one," he said. "I paid attention." Supper was elk stew with biscuits and Hassie Prout's coffee, which was outstanding in the way that coffee was outstanding when the person making it treated it as a serious undertaking rather than a daily obligation. 6 men at the table besides Sample, 4 Consolidated workers who boarded here for the convenience, one assayer named Rufus Cole, who had the abstracted air of a man who spent his days looking at rocks and had developed opinions about everything else as a result, and a young man named Tatum Gear who described himself as a timber surveyor and whose eyes moved around the table with a frequency that timber surveying did not fully account for. Sample noted Tatum Gear and said nothing about him. The Consolidated's workers talked about the upper workings, the freeze still holding above 5,000 feet, the equipment they'd need to break it loose when the thaw came. They talked about Mabry's plans for the East Bank extension. They talked the way men talked, who worked for something larger than themselves and had accepted the terms, not unhappily, just within the frame of those terms, the company's needs as ambient as the stamp mill's sound. Rufus Cole had opinions about the creek's mineral profile that he delivered to anyone in range whether they had asked or not. He had been in Sierra Creek for 2 seasons and had seen 3 independent operations absorbed by the Consolidated, and had views about this that he expressed in the indirect, heavily qualified language of a man who understood that what he said at this table went to Mabry's ears within a day. Tatum Gear ate without speaking and left the table first. After supper, the Consolidated's workers went to the saloon, and Rufus Cole went to the assay office, and Dewey Fitch went back to his claim, and Sample sat at the long table with his coffee, and Hassie Prout came and cleared the plates and then came back and poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. She had waited all evening to do this, and the waiting had been unhurried, which told Sample it was the thing she'd been planning since he walked in the door. "The other 2 men Dewey sent for," she said. "Tell me." First one was a Pinkerton out of Portland. Good man, I thought, serious, organized, asked the right questions. She turned her cup. He lasted 6 days. Left on a Tuesday morning, saying the case had insufficient grounds for his agency's involvement. Took the South Trail, fastest way out. She looked at the cup. He'd been riding a horse with a loose shoe the whole time he was here. Didn't get it fixed until the morning he left. A man who's leaving stays up the night before deciding. A man who's been told to leave fixes the shoe in the morning. Sample looked at her. Second man was a former deputy from Salem. 9 days. Received a letter on the 8th day from his wife in a town he'd told me he had no family in. She set the cup down. I read the postmark. Portland postmark on a letter from a wife in Grants Pass. Both men were reached, Sample said. Both men were reached, Hassie said. The question I couldn't answer was who reached them, because both times there was nothing obvious. No meeting with Mabry. No strangers in camp. Just a letter or a word at the saloon or something I missed. She looked at the stove. I don't miss much. You missed something. I missed something. She said it without apology. The statement of a woman who held herself to a standard and acknowledged when she fell short of it. Tatum Gear arrived the week before the Pinkerton. He was here the week before the deputy, too. Sample looked at the door. The young man had gone out. He's here all the time, Hassie said. Comes and goes. Says he's surveying timber contracts up the North Fork. Doesn't have calluses that timber surveying produces. She picked up her cup. He eats supper here, and he's at the saloon when I send someone to look. Who does he talk to? Everyone. Nobody in particular. He's pleasant company, and he doesn't drink more than 2. She looked at Sample directly. He was at the saloon both nights before each man decided to leave. The stamp mill ran its night shift at reduced capacity, the sound dropping to something lower and more intermittent after dark, the mountains settling around the drainage with the cold that came down from the snowpack above and pushed the day's warmth back up and out by 10 o'clock. Through the window the camp showed its few lamps, the saloon's yellow rectangle, one light at the Consolidated's main building, the assay office dark. You said you had something to tell me, Sample said. You've been organizing it since I walked in. Hassie looked at him. Most men, I'd have waited on that until I'd decided about them. How long does that usually take? Week, sometimes 2. She put both hands around her cup. You asked about Tatum Gear before I brought him up. That tells me something. It tells you I noticed him at supper. It tells me you noticed him at supper and held it until you thought it was useful. She looked at the stove's iron door, the fire behind it doing its steady work. Last fall, a letter came to this boarding house addressed to a man named Silas Greer. Misdirected. Meant for the Consolidated's office. I redirected it. She paused. After I read it. Sample waited. It came from a San Francisco address. Stationery from a hotel on Market Street. She had the letter in her memory the way she had everything. Not word for word, but the shape of it, the architecture of what it said. It was instructions. Acquisition timeline for the East Bank properties. The Fitch claim by name. A notation about prior complications on the North Fork and how they'd been resolved. She looked at Sample. The word it used for what happened to Bascom Reeves was resolved. The stamp mill made its night sound. The cold came down from the snowpack. Somewhere above the camp, the Douglas firs held the dark between them, and the stars showed through where the drainage opened at both ends, north and south, the mountains framing a strip of sky that was very clear and very far away. The San Francisco address, Sample said. I'll write it down for you. The name on the stationery. Hassie looked at him. Pacific Meridian Holdings. She paused. Means something to you? Sample picked up his coffee cup and looked at it and set it down. Not yet, he said. It did. He knew the $43,000 and the attorney who filed incorporation papers and the San Francisco hotel and the man with silver hair and a Portland land investor's smile who had left a calling card on a writing desk in Oregon City in January as a statement of ongoing intent. He knew the shape of a system that reorganized itself when one instrument failed and found a new instrument in a new territory with new names on the paper and the same money underneath. He did not say any of this to Hassie Prout. What he said was, The timber surveyor. Tatum Gear. When does he usually go to the saloon? 9 o'clock. Stays until 11. Does he know which room I'm in? Has he considered this? I didn't tell him. But this boarding house has 6 rooms, and 5 of them are spoken for by men he knows. She held his eyes. He'll know by morning. He'll know tonight, Sample said. Who carries information at night in this camp? Hassie picked up the coffee cups and set them on the sideboard by the stove and turned back. Mabry has a man who walks the perimeter of the Consolidated's property after dark, ostensibly for security. His name is Harv Bolan, and he has been doing this walk for 2 years, and in 2 years he has never caught anyone at anything. She looked at the window. But he goes past every building in camp in the course of the walk. Every building? Every building, Hassie said. Including this one. Usually around 10. Sample stood and took his hat from the table. If Tatum Gear leaves the saloon before 11 tonight, I want to know. You don't need to come find me. I'll be where I can see him. Hassie looked at him with the complete inventory look she'd given him at the door. You're going to follow him. I'm going to see who he talks to, Sample said. Those are different things. He went upstairs and got his coat and the Spencer carbine and came back down and went out the front door into the cold March dark of Sierra Creek, where the stamp mill ran its night percussion, and the stars showed through the drainage gap above, and Tatum Gear was at the saloon being pleasant company, and not drinking more than 2, and somewhere in the camp the thing that had taken Leland Fitch was resting between its decisions. Sample moved off the boarding house porch into the dark between the buildings, where the mud was frozen hard at this hour, and the cold held everything it touched, and he went to find the geometry of the camp at night, which was always different from the geometry in daylight and always more honest. Chapter 2. Tatum Gear left the saloon at 10:15. Sample had been in the gap between the assay office and the equipment shed for 40 minutes, standing in mud that had frozen solid at this hour, and he watched Gear come out the saloon door and stop on the step and look up the street, and then down it with the unhurried scan of a man checking the weather. Not checking the weather. The sky had been clear all evening, and Gear had known that when he went in. He went up the street. Not toward the workers' quarters where his bunk was. Up toward the Consolidated's main building, which sat at the creek's edge with its back to the water and its front facing the camp's central track, a log structure 2 rooms wide with a covered porch and a lamp burning in the back office window. The lamp had been burning when Sample arrived at his position. Nobody had gone in or come out the front. Harv Bolan had passed the main building at 10:05 on his perimeter walk, moving north to south, taking 11 minutes to cover the circuit that Sample had timed from memory after watching him twice earlier in the evening. By the time Gear reached the back entrance, Bolan was at the south end of his circuit, 150 yards away in the dark. Gear knew the interval. He went in the back, and the lamp in the office window threw his shadow briefly against the glass, and then settled back to its original arrangement, whoever was inside having moved to receive him. 22 minutes later, Gear came out the same way he'd gone in, stood in the dark behind the building for a moment, doing nothing visible, and walked back to the workers' quarters at the pace of a man returning from the outhouse. Sample stayed in his position until Bolan completed his next circuit. No variation in the walk. No stop at the main building. Whatever Bolan was paid to see, the main building's back entrance after 10 o'clock was not on the list. He went back to Hassie's and slept 4 hours and was at the table when she came down at 5:30 to start breakfast. She looked at him across the kitchen and read what the night had produced without asking about it, the way she read most things, and put the coffee on. Gear went to the Consolidated's back office at 10:15, Sample said. 22 minutes. The office lamp was already lit when he got there. Hassie set the coffee pot on the stove. Mabry keeps late hours. Is Mabry the only one who uses that office at night? He's the only one with a key to it. She took the bread from the previous evening's baking and began slicing it. Most nights he's in there until 11, sometimes midnight. He does the books after the day shift ends. She cut the bread with the economy of someone who had made this motion 10,000 times. 2 nights out of 7, he has company. What kind? The kind that comes in the back and leaves the same way. She set the bread on the board. I don't know names. I know horses. There's a roan that ties at the back post 2 nights a week, Tuesdays and Fridays most often, and it belongs to a man who rides down from the upper camp. What upper camp? There's a secondary operation 4 miles up the North Fork. The Consolidated runs it, but doesn't advertise it. Timber cutting, ostensibly. She looked at the stove. That's where Harv Bolin goes on his days off, when he has them. Which is Tuesdays and Fridays. Bolin's the connection between the main camp and the upper operation. That's what I think. She poured 2 cups. I can't prove it. You don't need to prove it, Sample said. I do. She sat across from him and held her cup in both hands the way she always did, the morning posture of a woman who had earned her coffee through an hour of cold kitchen before anyone else in the building was awake. Outside the window, the camp was still dark, the ridge to the east blocking the dawn, only the stamp mill running its reduced night operation, the sound lower and more deliberate at this hour, each stroke of it arriving separately instead of blurring into the general percussion of the day. You said 3 things last night, Sample said. You gave me Gear and the 2 men who left. You gave me Pacific Meridian Holdings. There's more about Bascom Reeves, Hassie said. Tell me. She set her cup down. The night before Bascom went into the ravine. His wife Nora was at my table. She came down twice a month for supplies and usually stayed a night. She told me a rider had come to their claim that evening. Gray horse, white blaze running the full length of the face. She didn't see the man, just the horse, because Bascom went out to meet the rider, and she watched from the window. She told the marshal's deputy this. She told the first deputy, the one who came out in 72 when Bascom died. Hassie's voice held its level register. The deputy wrote down what she said and lost the paper, or filed it somewhere it never came out of, or made a decision about what was important and what wasn't. She looked at the window. The gray horse with the blaze has been in the Consolidated's corral since the spring of 72. I see it every time I go past. Sample thought about that. A horse was not testimony. A horse in a corral was not evidence of anything, except that someone in the Consolidated's operation rode a gray with a blaze. And there were more gray horses in the Oregon mountains than there were men who could account for their whereabouts on a specific night 2 years ago. But Nora Reeves had described it to a deputy who had done nothing with the description, and the deputy had worked a territory where the Consolidated had interests, and the Consolidated had a habit of reaching men who were inconvenient. The letter, Sample said. The misdirected letter to Silas Greer. You gave me the name Pacific Meridian Holdings. Tell me the rest of it. Hassie looked at the table's surface. She had the letter organized in her memory, in sections Sample understood, and she was moving to the section she hadn't reached the night before. It was instructions, written by someone who didn't use their name, only initials at the bottom. C.A. Sample's coffee cup stayed where it was. The instructions covered 3 items, Hassie said. First, the acquisition timeline for the remaining East Bank properties. The Fitch claim by name, with a notation that prior approaches had been declined and that alternative resolution should be pursued before the spring survey season. She looked at him. It used the phrase alternative resolution, the way people use phrases when they mean something they don't want to write plainly. Second item. Confirmation that the North Fork secondary operation was producing sufficient cover for the workforce management activities. She said it back, exactly as she'd read it, the phrasing intact in her memory. Workforce management. I thought about that for a long time. A mining operation manages its workforce by hiring and firing. It doesn't need a secondary location 4 miles up the mountain for that. Third, a question about Silas Greer's timeline for the Portland Incorporation filings. CA wanted the Sierra Creek Consolidated's Oregon Territory papers finalized before a specific date in January of '74. She looked at him. That date has passed. The filings went through. The Consolidated's papers are filed and registered, Hassie said. I checked at the county seat in November. Sample picked up his coffee. The initials sat in the back of his thinking, the way things sat when they confirmed a thing he'd already known and hadn't wanted to finish knowing. See it. A San Francisco hotel on Market Street. $43,000 and a new name, and the understanding that a system that had failed in one territory needed a new instrument in a new one. And the instrument had been selected and funded and was running a stamp mill on a mountain creek in Oregon while the principal stayed behind his layers of incorporation in a city 2 days south. Cornelius Abel. He did not say this to Hassie Prout. The initials, he said. C.A. You've thought about them. I've thought about them for 4 months, Hassie said. I don't have a name to put to them. I know they belong to someone in San Francisco with enough money to fund a mining operation and enough caution to stay out of the paperwork. That's enough to know for now, Sample said. She looked at him with the look that said she understood he had more than that and had decided not to share it, and that she found this acceptable because she'd been sharing information with a man she'd known for 12 hours and self-preservation was its own reasonable argument. Silas Greer, Sample said. The Portland attorney. Have you seen him here? Once. Last October. He came up with a man from the county land office, spent 2 days, left. She refilled his cup without being asked. He's a small man, precise, with the manner of someone who has spent his career making sure the paper is correct regardless of what the paper covers. He came before Leland disappeared. 3 weeks before. The kitchen filled slowly with the sounds of the boarding house waking. Boots on the floorboards above, water running. The particular percussion of 6 men getting themselves ready for a day's work in the mountain cold. Sample drank his coffee and looked at the window where the sky above the east ridge had gone from black to the dark blue of early dawn, the stars losing their conviction, the ridge itself becoming visible as a line rather than an absence. One more thing, Hassie said. He waited. Leland Fitch came to me the week before he disappeared. She looked at the table. He didn't say he was frightened. He wasn't the kind of man who said that. But he asked me if I'd hold something for him. And I said yes, and he gave me an envelope and said if he didn't come to get it within 30 days I should give it to Dewey. She paused. He didn't come to get it. You didn't give it to Dewey. I gave it to Dewey in November. He read it and put it in his coat and didn't say what was in it, and I didn't ask. She looked up. He'll tell you, or he won't. That's between you and him. Sample pushed back from the table. Breakfast, at what hour? 7. You're not eating. I'll eat at the claim. He stood and took his hat from the chair beside him. The gray horse with the blaze. Where does it tie when it's not in the corral? Hassie considered this. Mabry's man who does the Tuesday and Friday run from the upper camp. If he's the rider Nora Reeves saw, he'd have come down the North Fork Trail which comes out behind the equipment shed. She looked at him. Same gap you were standing in last night. So he knew I was there. He didn't come last night, Hassie said. Yesterday was Wednesday. The Fitch claim occupied 200 yards of the creek's east bank, staked at its corners with posts Leland had set himself, the boundary markers carved with the Fitch brand, an F with a horizontal bar through its middle, the mark of a man who had learned that what belonged to you needed to say so plainly. The creek ran against the east bank here with the force of the late winter melt, brown and cold, and faster than it would be in August, cutting the bank in a long curve that had taken years off the bank's edge and deposited it downstream as the fine gravel that made placer work viable. Dewey was in the water when Sample arrived, hip-deep in the current, with a sluice box running off a wooden flume he'd built to redirect the creek's flow across the gravel bar. He worked the gravel through the sluice with a long-handled rake, the motion repetitive and precise, the water taking the light material off the top, and the riffles at the sluice's bottom catching what was heavy. He'd been at it since first light by the look of him, wet to the chest from a stumble or a rogue current, hands red from the cold water, the posture of a man doing hard physical work in a cold river, and having decided some time before dawn that this was what the day required. He looked up when Sample came down the bank. You eat, Sample said. I'll eat tonight. He pulled the rake through another load of gravel. You talked to Hassie. She told me about the envelope. Dewey worked the rake. The creek made its loud, indifferent sound around him, the water not caring about any of the things that happened on its banks, which was a quality Sample had always found either comforting or terrible, depending on the circumstances. Leland wrote it the week before he went, Dewey said. Said if something happened, he wanted me to have what he knew, in case it was useful to whoever came looking. What did he know? Come down here, Dewey said. I'll show you something first. Sample went down the bank to the water's edge and crouched on the gravel, the creek running fast 3 feet in front of his boots, cold air rising off it. Dewey pulled the rake out and pointed upstream with it, toward the north, where the creek bent around a gravel bar and the Consolidated's east bank equipment came into view. A pump system, a larger sluice operation, the infrastructure of a company with capital to spend rather than a two-man family claim. See where their operation ends, Dewey said. Sample looked. The Consolidated's east bank equipment stopped at a line maybe 60 yards upstream. Between that line and the Fitch claim's north stake, a stretch of bank sat unworked, no equipment, no disturbed ground, the gravel bar intact. That stretch is yours, Sample said. That stretch is where the creek runs over the hard rock cap, Dewey said. Right there, under 12 feet of gravel and creek water. Leland's surveyor put the drill down and hit cap rock at 9 feet on the north end of our claim and 8.5 on the south. He lowered the rake. The Consolidated surveyor has been working toward that same cap from the west. They've got shafts sunk on the west bank going east. They know exactly what's under there. And they can't access it efficiently from the west. They need to come down from the north or up from the south. Both approaches run across our claim. Dewey pulled the rake back and went back to working the gravel with a kind of controlled fury that was different from the mechanical repetition it resembled. The cap runs 300 yards along the creek bed. Leland estimated, his surveyor estimated, the yield on a hard rock extraction as somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 over a 5-year operation. The creek ran. The Consolidated's pump worked its steady sound upstream. Somewhere above the ridgeline, a hawk made a single flat note and went quiet. $400,000. Sample looked at the boundary marker on the north stake, the carved F with its horizontal bar, and thought about a man who had known what was under his creek and had hired a Portland surveyor to document it, and had hidden the documentation in a split log and had written an envelope to his brother and had gone out one morning and not come back. The envelope, Sample said. What did it say? Dewey worked the rake for another full minute before he answered. Not stalling, processing, running through what was in the letter against the question of what to give to a man he'd known for less than a day. Leland heard a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear, Dewey said. 2 weeks before he disappeared. He was checking the north stake at dusk, and Mabry and another man were on the west bank above him, and didn't see him in the shadow of the bank. He pulled the rake out and shook the gravel off and pointed it into the current to rinse it. The other man was from outside camp. Leland didn't recognize him. They were talking about the survey, Leland's independent survey, and about what would need to happen before Aldous Webb could be asked to do any further work in the Sierra Creek area. Asked to not do any further work. That's how Leland put it in the letter. He said the way the other man said it was the part that told him what they meant. He set the rake against the sluice box and waded to the bank and climbed out, water streaming from his clothes. He was shivering, and either didn't notice or had decided not to. The other man said it the way you say something when the alternative isn't a conversation, it's an arrangement. Did Leland describe the other man? Big. Well-dressed for being on a mountain. City boots. Dewey picked up a rag from the bank and worked it over his hands without warming them much. He said the man laughed once during the conversation, and the laugh didn't sound like it cost him anything. Said it was the kind of laugh a man used to fill a space where feeling should be. Sample looked upstream at the Consolidated's East Bank equipment and the unworked stretch between it and the Fitch North stake, and thought about Ira Mabry on a west bank at dusk with a well-dressed man in city boots, and a laugh that cost nothing, discussing what would need to happen before a Portland surveyor could be asked to stop working. Leland ran, Sample said. He ran after he wrote the letter. He didn't tell me he was running. The letter just said what he'd heard and where he'd hidden the survey, and to hold the claim no matter what. Dewey looked at the creek, at the water running over the gravel bar above the hard rock cap. He's a stubborn man. Holding the claim is the thing he'd ask for. You think he's alive? Dewey looked at him directly for the first time since Sample had come down the bank. I think a man who knew they were coming would know the country well enough to get somewhere they couldn't find him. Leland has been on this creek 4 years. He held the look. I think it's possible. I don't know. That's why I wrote to Marshal Giddings. Show me where Gideon Lease works, Sample said. Dewey looked at him. You know about Lease? Not much. Tell me on the way. They went up the bank together and along the creek path toward the Consolidated's perimeter, Dewey wringing water from his sleeves as he walked, the cold air pulling steam off him, the stamp mill coming back up to its day shift volume as the morning crew took over from the night shift, the sound filling the drainage wall to wall and sitting there. Lease has been with the Consolidated 2 years, Dewey said. Came from Kentucky, worked timber operations in Washington Territory before this. He's a Baptist in the way that some mountain men are Baptist, meaning he uses it to account for what he does and doesn't do, not to tell other people what they should. He stepped over a root the creek had exposed in the bank. He and Leland played cards on Saturday evenings. Not at the saloon, at the claim cabin. Just the two of them. Friends. Leland didn't call men friends easily. But Lise came to the cabin on Saturdays and Leland let him, which covers the same ground. Dewey stopped and pointed to the Consolidated's operation on the east bank, where the crew worked the upper sluice. A man stood at the sluice's head, directing two younger workers in the placement of a new set of riffles, his instructions spare and precise, his hands showing them the angle before they tried it with the wood. That's Lise. Sample looked at him. Gideon Lise was perhaps 35, with a broad, composed face, and the build of a man who had done heavy outdoor work since he was old enough to be put to it, the kind of build that came from decades of timber and mining, and the mountain country that required both. He wore his work the way capable men wore it, without performing the capability, just doing what the job needed and letting the results speak. He glanced at Sample once across the creek, and looked back at his workers. One glance, long enough to register Sample, standing with Dewey on the opposite bank. Not long enough to be surveillance. "He knows who I am," Sample said. "He knew before you got here," Dewey said. "Lise knows everything that happens in this camp. It's how he stays ahead of it." He looked across the creek at his brother's Saturday card partner. "He won't come to you. If you want what he knows, you'll have to go to him." "Tonight," Sample said. "He walks the North Fork Trail after supper. Alone. He says it's for the quiet." Dewey looked at Sample. "He's been walking it every night for 3 weeks. Since right around when Leland's 11 weeks started. He's been waiting. That's what I think." Dewey turned away from the creek and started back toward the sluice. "I think Gideon Lise has something that belongs to my brother, and he's been waiting for someone he thought could use it." Sample looked across the creek at Lise, who had gone back to the riffles placement and was showing the younger worker the angle again, his patience for the repetition complete. A man who had watched 2 people die or disappear in the service of the operation he worked for, who had kept what he knew and kept coming to work every morning, and kept walking the North Fork Trail every night for 3 weeks, waiting for the right person to walk it with him. The creek ran between them, cold and loud and indifferent to the accounting of what had happened on its banks. Sample went back up the bank to find Hassie and eat something and think about what the afternoon needed to look like before the evening came and the North Fork Trail offered whatever it was going to offer. Behind him, Dewey Fitch went back into the creek. The rake went in. The gravel came up. The water took the light material off the top, and the riffles caught what was heavy, the same motion it had been since 4 in the morning, the same motion it would be until dark, the stubborn insistence of a man holding what was his while the mountain held his brother somewhere in its cold eastern folds, either alive or resolved, and Dewey working the creek because the creek was the thing Leland had asked him to hold, and Dewey Fitch intended to hold it. The stamp mill ran above all of it, and the ridges held the sound down, and the morning went about its business. Chapter 3. The North Fork Trail left the creek path at a split marked by a blaze on a Douglas fir, the blaze old enough to have weathered gray, the tree big enough that the blaze sat at chest height on Sample and eye height on whoever had put it there. The trail climbed from the creek elevation through scrub alder and then into the big timber, where the snow still held under the canopy in a dirty gray crust that the March sun hadn't reached. It smelled like cold pine resin and the particular damp of snowmelt starting its slow work through root systems, the earth not warm yet but remembering that it would be. Gideon Lise was 100 yards up the trail when Sample found him, standing in the timber looking at the ridgeline above, his breath visible in the cold air, not moving. Sample came up beside him and looked at the same ridgeline. "You're not counting timber," Sample said. "Not tonight," Lise said. They stood together and looked at the ridge for a moment, the snow up there still deep and clean against the darkening sky, the last light catching it in a way that made it look closer than it was. "Dewey says you walk this trail every night," Sample said. "It's quiet up here." "The camp's quiet after 9. Lise looked at the ridge. Different kind of quiet. He turned and started up the trail again, and Sample walked beside him where the trail allowed it and behind him where it didn't. And they went up through the timber for a quarter-mile without speaking. An owl called from somewhere in the dark canopy above them and went quiet, and called again from a different position, working through its evening territory. "You knew Leland Fitch," Sample said. "Played cards with him Saturdays. You knew what was under his claim." Lise walked. "Leland told me what his surveyor found. October, before the man came up. He stepped over a root that crossed the trail, a big root, a tree that had been there long enough to work its way to the surface and make the trail adjust to it. He was proud of it. Not loud proud, just the quiet kind of man gets when something he worked for turns out to be worth more than he figured. And then the surveyor came and went, and Leland disappeared. 3 months later, Lise stopped at a place where the trail widened onto a small bench, a flat in the hillside maybe 20 feet across, the timber opening enough to show the valley below, the camp's few lights visible through the trees, the stamp mill a faint percussion at this distance. He looked at the lights. "I helped carry Bascom Reeves out of that ravine," he said. "You know about that." "I know what's in the official record." "The official record says he fell." Lise looked at the camp lights. Bascom was a mountain man. He'd been in that country 10 years. He knew every inch of that ravine. He turned and looked at Sample in the near dark. "A week before he died, a man came to his claim after supper. I saw the man ride past on the North Fork Trail, going toward the Reeves operation. Gray horse, white blaze. He was on the trail before I could see him clear, but I saw the horse. The same horse Nora Reeves had described to the deputy. The horse in the Consolidated's corral." "You didn't tell the deputy," Sample said. "I told Mabry." Lise looked at his boots. "Before the deputy arrived. I thought," he stopped. "Found the plainer version. I thought Mabry would want to know. I thought he'd take it seriously." "What did Mabry say?" "He thanked me. Said he'd look into it." Lise turned back toward the trail. "The deputy came and went, and nothing came of it, and I understood what Mabry had done with what I told him. He started walking, which was take note of who'd seen what, and make sure the deputy didn't hear about it." Sample followed him down the trail toward the camp. "After Leland," Lise said. "Tell me." "Day after Leland didn't come back, I went to the North Stake. Leland had used a split in the base log to store things before. I'd seen him put a letter in it once, a letter he was waiting to send, keeping it dry. He walked without looking back. The survey was in there, rolled in oilskin tied with cord. He paused at a bend in the trail. I took it. Because Dewey alone wasn't enough. Because Dewey is a good man, and an angry one, and an angry man with a piece of paper, and no one to help him use it ends up where Bascom Reeves ended up." Lise looked at him over his shoulder. "I needed someone who knew what to do with what it says." "Do you trust me yet?" Sample said. Lise walked for another 20 yards. The camp was audible again below them, the stamp mill finding them on the trail, the sound coming up through the timber. "I trust that you're still here," he said. The other 2 men weren't, by this point. He stepped off the trail onto the creek path and stopped. "I'll bring it to you tomorrow. Come to the East Bank equipment at the noon break when Mabry takes his dinner." "All right," Sample said. Lise went one direction on the creek path, and Sample went the other, and the night settled back into what it had been before they'd talked. The timber and the cold and the owl somewhere in the canopy above working its territory. The week ran on from there. Sample played cards at Wiley Sapp's saloon every evening from 7 until 10, which was closing time at Sapp's because Sapp went to bed at 10 and expected everyone else to have somewhere else to be by then. Sapp was a compact man of 50, with the deliberate calm of someone who had run a saloon in a mining camp long enough to have seen every variety of human behavior and had arrived at a comprehensive policy of non-involvement. He poured drinks, kept the cards clean, broke up the occasional dispute with the minimum effective force, and offered opinions on nothing. He was the most genuinely neutral person in Sierra Creek, which made him, Sample decided, the most trustworthy source of purely factual information. Who was in camp when they arrived, when they left, what they ordered. He was also the worst card player in the game. The Thursday night game ran 4 players: Sample, Lease, Rufus Cole the assayer, and a consolidated shift worker named Alan Bray, who played with the conservative calculation of a man protecting a specific amount he could afford to lose and no more. Bray was not a source of information so much as an indicator of camp morale. What the workers talked about among themselves, what they complained about, what they accepted as the cost of steady wages and regular payment in a business where those things were not guaranteed. Bray talked about the East Bank extension, Mabry's plan to push the Consolidated's operation further into the creek's upper reach in the spring thaw. He talked about it with the muted enthusiasm of a man who understood the extension meant more work and more pay, but who had seen enough of the creek's upper reach to have reservations about the ground conditions. He talked about the equipment they'd need, the pump capacity required, the shaft work that the geologist out of Portland had said was necessary before anyone went further into the West Bank. "Noel's been down those shafts twice this week," Bray said on the Thursday hand. "Every time he comes up, he looks like a man who found something he wasn't expecting." "Good or bad?" Sample said. Bray shrugged, which was his response to questions that went above the pay grade he'd established for himself. "Above my level. Noel keeps his findings to Mabry." Sample looked at his cards. Across the table, Lease dealt the next hand with the care of a man who shuffled thoroughly and had opinions about how a deck should be handled, and said nothing about Arvid Noel. He'd said nothing about anything useful for 2 nights. On the Friday game, he said nothing useful either, and Sample let it develop the way you let a slow current develop, not fighting it, just noting its direction. Lease was not withholding. He was building to something at his own pace, and pushing it would produce a worse result than waiting. Rufus Cole, who talked constantly, offered information in the way of a man who had no idea which of his observations were significant, everything coming out at the same volume, the useful and the useless indistinguishable by any surface quality. He talked about the creek's mineral profile in terms that required more geology than Sample had, and about the assay results he'd been running on samples from the West Bank shafts in terms that he trimmed carefully when Alan Bray was within earshot. What came through the trimming was this: the West Bank samples were producing results that the Portland geologist had characterized as exceptional in his report to Mabry, and Mabry had instructed Cole to file the assay results under a category that did not appear in the camp's regular reporting. "What category?" Sample said. "He called it preliminary data," Cole said, "which in a proper operation means results you're not confident enough to formalize. In this operation, it means results you don't want in a document that anyone outside this camp might read." He looked at his cards with the absorbed expression of a man who found cards far less interesting than rocks. "I'm a professional," he said, which in this context meant he filed what he was told to file, and noted his reservations to himself and continued doing his job. Sample played his hand, and thought about West Bank assay results filed as preliminary data, and about a hard rock deposit under the Fitch claim that the Consolidated's own surveys confirmed, and about a Portland geologist's report calling the samples exceptional, and about what $400,000 looked like to a man in San Francisco writing letters signed with 2 initials. Thursday, he worked a day on the Fitch claim. Dewey put him to work at the sluice, which was harder than it looked and wetter than was comfortable in March, and Sample worked the long handle of the rake through gravel and cold water for 6 hours and came out with a working understanding of the creek's east bank that no amount of looking from the path would have given him. The gravel bar above the hard rock cap had a different feel than the upstream gravel. Denser, the rake meeting more resistance at depth, the creek running shallower over it because the cap lifted the bed. Leland Fitch had known this creek the way a man knew the floor of a room he'd lived in for years, every variation in its surface a known fact. He'd known what was under the gravel before the Portland surveyor confirmed it. The Consolidated's East Bank equipment stopped 60 yards north of the Fitch North Stake, at a line that had nothing to do with the Consolidated's claim boundary. Their claim ran 10 yards further south, and everything to do with the cap rock, which deepened on the Consolidated side of that line, until extraction through the creek bed was no longer the efficient approach. The efficient approach was from the Fitch side, where the cap ran closest to the surface, and a series of angled shafts could reach it without the pump capacity and depth the West Bank shafts required. The Consolidated knew this. At the noon break, Lease came down the East Bank path and stood near the water at the edge of the Fitch claim and waited until Dewey went to the cabin for his dinner. He pulled a rolled oilskin from inside his coat and held it out, and Sample took it. "That's what Leland's surveyor found," Lease said. "Coordinates, depth measurements, estimated yield. It's signed and dated." He looked at the creek. Dated 3 months before Leland went. Sample tucked the oilskin inside his own coat. "You helped carry Bascom Reeves out of the ravine?" "Yes." "Where exactly did you find him?" Lease pointed south along the creek path, toward where the North Fork Trail descended from the ridge. "There's a ravine, cuts the ridge about a mile below the trail junction. He was at the bottom of it." He looked at the ridge. "The thing about that ravine is that to get to the bottom of it from the top, you have to know where the top is. It doesn't show from the trail. You have to go into the timber 30 yards off the path to find the edge." Bascom knew it was there. He'd have had no reason to go off the trail in that direction. Lease looked at the creek. A man following that trail in the dark, who didn't know the ravine was there, could go off the edge. He paused. A man being led off the trail by someone who did know could go off the same edge. Sample looked at the ridge. The ravine was not visible from here, the timber too dense, the ridge too steep to read from below. "You've been in that ravine." "I went back the week after they brought Bascom out." "Alone?" Lease turned away from the ridge. "There are scuff marks on the rock face about 15 feet down. Both sides of the ravine, like something had scraped both walls in sequence." He looked at Sample. "A man falling doesn't hit both walls. He falls. Someone put him over." "That's what I think." He started back up the path, toward the Consolidated's equipment. "Think and know are different things." "I know the difference," Sample said. Lease went back to his crew. Sample went back to the sluice and worked the afternoon out, and came up from the creek at dusk with the oilskin survey against his chest and the ravine's geometry in his thinking, the scuff marks on both walls 15 feet down, and thought about what kind of man took someone to a ravine they knew in the dark, and what the creek and the mountain thought about it, which was nothing, the mountain and the creek being the most consistent things in this country in their complete indifference to the accounting of what happened on their surfaces. By Saturday, Sample had the camp structure mapped in his thinking. Two crew bosses beside Lease, a man named Luther Pruitt, who ran the West Bank shaft operation, and a man named Emmett Slade, who managed the stamp mill and its supporting equipment. Both were in Mabry's confidence, in the way of men who had been paid to be, and had made no independent accounting of what that confidence required of them. Pruitt was ex-military, Georgia originally, with the bearing of a man who had decided after the war that working for whoever paid reliably was as much loyalty as he owed anyone, and had organized his life around that decision cleanly and without obvious regret. Slade was younger, ambitious, the stamp mill a stepping stone in his own calculation toward something larger, which made him attentive to Mabry's approval in the way of men who understood that approval from the right person was a form of currency. Neither of them talked about Leland Fitch. Not avoidance exactly. They simply did not speak the name, the way people in mining camps did not speak certain names, a collective omission maintained by no visible agreement, just the social pressure of everyone else also not speaking it. The workers below crew boss level talked about him. Carefully. In the manner of men discussing something that was not safe to discuss, but was too present to ignore entirely. The conversation surfacing in fragments at the saloon's edge, and on the path between shifts, never completed, always trailing off when the relevant silence arrived. What Sample assembled from the fragments, Leland had been liked. Not universally. He was independent, and that read as stubbornness to some, but genuinely liked in the way of a man who dealt straight and kept his word. The Consolidated workers, who'd worked adjacent to his operation on the East Bank, had gotten along with him. When he disappeared, several of them had gone to Mabry asking whether a search party should go out. Mabry had said the marshal's office was handling it. The marshal's office sent a deputy 5 weeks later. On the Saturday card game, Lease arrived and sat and played 2 hands without speaking. And then on the third hand, while Sapp poured around and Cole was recounting an assay result that nobody had asked about, Lease said to the table generally and to Sample specifically, "You know what kind of man files a claim and then disappears on the same day his neighbor refuses to sell?" Cole stopped talking. Alan Bray looked at his cards. Sapp poured the drinks and went back behind the bar. "Tell me," Sample said. "A man with a system," Lease said. He picked up his cards and looked at them. Not a temper. Not a grudge. A man with a system doesn't get angry. He makes a plan and runs it, and the next step in the plan follows from the last one, and none of it is personal. He arranged his cards. Bascom Reeves refused to sell in September of '72. He was dead by November. He looked at his hand. Leland Fitch refused to sell in October of '73. He was gone by December. Cole looked at the table surface. 2 months, Sample said. Give or take. Lease put his cards down. The system has a timeline. Whatever it does in about 2 months. Long enough that the connection isn't obvious. Short enough that the situation resolves before the claimant can organize any resistance. You've been thinking about this a while, Sample said. Since November of '72, Lease said. When I understood what Mabry did with what I told him about the gray horse. Sample looked at his own cards. A reasonable hand. He played it the way he played most things, not showing what he had until it was useful to show it. The man Leland heard on the West Bank. Talking to Mabry. Big man, city boots, expensive coat. Lease was quiet for a moment. You've seen Leland's letter. Dewey showed me. The man came through camp twice, Lease said. Once in October of '72, month before Bascom went into the ravine. Once in October of '73, month before Leland went. He looked at the cards he'd put down. Both times he arrived on the afternoon stage from the valley. Stayed 2 nights in Mabry's office. Left before anyone had a real conversation with him. He picked his cards up again. He didn't give his name. Didn't eat at Hassie's. Didn't drink at Sap's. What did he do for 2 days? Talked to Mabry. Looked at the Consolidated's maps and surveys. Rode the creek with Mabry one afternoon, both times on the same route, East Bank up to the Fitch claim, then up the North Fork to the upper operation. He went to the upper operation. Both visits, Lee said. Spent half a day up there the second time. Sample looked at his cards and thought about the upper camp 4 miles up the North Fork, the secondary operation that Hassie called timber cutting ostensibly, where Harv Bolin went on Tuesdays and Fridays and the roan horse came from. The well-dressed man from the city, spending half a day there. Workforce management activities, Sample said, using the language from the San Francisco letter. Lease looked at him sharply. Something Hassie read, Sample said. Lease held the look for a moment, and then nodded, a slow nod, the nod of a man receiving a piece that went somewhere he'd already known a piece was missing. I've wondered about that camp since Bascom, he said. Wondered what it is up there that needs Harv Bolin twice a week. Does Mabry go up? Not often. He sends Bolin. Lease picked up a card from the deck and set it down. Bolin doesn't say what he does up there. Men who ask about his trips stop being asked on shift for a few days afterward, which is Mabry's way of saying the question landed somewhere it shouldn't. Cole, across the table, had been listening with the concentrated absorption of a man who was telling himself he was not listening, and who would not remember this conversation later if anyone asked him. He played a card without looking at it, and it was entirely the wrong card for his hand, which told Sample everything about where Cole's attention was. Alanbre finished his drink and left at 9, which was early for him. He did it without comment, putting his remaining coins in his pocket and nodding at the table and going, the departure of a man who had heard more than his pay grade covered and had decided to be somewhere else. Sap watched him go and looked at the clock on the wall behind the bar and said nothing. Arvid Noel Sample had been watching since the Wednesday morning at the creek when Lease had pointed him out on the Consolidated's East Bank. He was a slight man of 40, fair-haired and sun-darkened, with a surveyor's habitual squint and the quality of motion that belongs to men who spent their days moving through rough terrain with expensive instruments, deliberate, placing each step aware of the ground. He carried a leather satchel everywhere he went, the kind with a reinforced bottom that held rolled documents without crushing them. He ate breakfast at Hassie's on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were the days his work took him away from the Consolidated's main camp and put him closer to the boarding house's end of the creek. Sample had been at the table both mornings. On the Thursday morning, Noel had sat across the table from Rufus Cole, and they discussed the West Bank shaft results in the circumspect language of 2 professionals who knew they were in a public dining room and adjusted their specificity accordingly. What came through the adjustments? Noel had found a discrepancy between what the shafts showed and what the Portland geologist's report projected for the West Bank. The discrepancy was not in the Consolidated's favor. The efficient extraction path the geologist had modeled ran into a fault line at depth that Noel's actual shaft surveys had identified and that the geologist's surface projections had missed. Which meant the West Bank extraction was harder and more expensive than anyone had told Mabry. Which meant the Fitch claims East Bank approach was not just convenient. It was necessary. Noel ate his breakfast and said none of this directly, and said all of it through the careful editing of what he chose not to say. And Sample listened and drank Hassie's coffee and watched the man's hands, which were a surveyor's hands, precise in their movements, never idle, the fingers doing small calculations on the table surface when his mind was working, counting intervals, measuring invisible distances. His eyes, when they moved to Sample, moved away fast. Not rudeness. Fear. The specific fear of a man who knew what his work had been used for, and had been using the knowledge as a private burden for long enough that being looked at felt like being caught. On Tuesday morning of the following week, a week and a day after Sample had ridden into camp, a Consolidated worker named Harv Bolin knocked on the boarding house door at 7:30 and asked Hassie if a Mr. Sample was available. Hassie came to the bottom of the stairs and called up. Sample came down with his coffee. Bolin stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, the hat in hands posture of a man delivering a message he'd been told to deliver and wanted done with. He was 40, heavy-set, with a face that looked like it had absorbed some arguments over the years and had not won all of them. He'd done the perimeter walks for 2 years without catching anyone at anything, and he stood in Hassie's doorway with the specific discomfort of a man who had been the night watchman for an operation he understood less thoroughly than he'd believed. "Mr. Mabry's compliments," Bolin said. "He'd like to know if you'd join him for supper this evening. His office, 7 o'clock. He said to tell you the cook does a better elk roast than anything else in camp." Sample drank his coffee. "Tell Mr. Mabry I appreciate the invitation." Bolin waited. "And yes," Sample said. Bolin put his hat on and left. Sample watched him go up the creek path toward the Consolidated's main building, the heavy-set walk of a man who delivered messages and walked perimeters and asked no questions above his level, and thought about who else in camp would know about this invitation by noon. "You're going," Hassie said from behind him. "I'm going. He's been watching you all week." She came and took the empty coffee cup from his hand and turned back toward the kitchen. A man like Mabry watches until he decides watching isn't enough, and then he does something. "What's he decided?" Sample said. Hassie looked over her shoulder. "That you're not going to leave the way the other two did." She went into the kitchen. "So, he's going to try something else." Sample looked at the creek path, at Bolin's retreating back, at the Consolidated's main building beyond, the porch lamp unlit in the morning light, the back office window showing nothing. Somewhere inside, Ira Mabry was having his breakfast and had already thought further into tonight's supper than the elk roast. Sample went upstairs and got the oilskin survey from inside his coat and found the loose board under the bed that Hassie had shown him the first morning. "Every room has one," she'd said, showing him where it was, "because every man in a place like this needs somewhere," and put the survey there and replaced the board and went back downstairs to find Dewey. He had today to finish building the picture before the picture started to build itself. Chapter 4. Bolin left for the upper camp at 2 in the afternoon with a mule loaded with provisions, and the unhurried pace of a man on a regular route who had stopped thinking about the route and was thinking about whatever came next on it. Sample watched him go from the creek path, the mule's hooves finding the North Fork Trail junction and turning without being directed, the animal knowing the way better than the man on it. The roan horse would be waiting up there. Or it wouldn't be, because the roan's rider came Tuesdays and Fridays, and this was only Tuesday afternoon. And whatever happened at the upper camp on those visits happened in the evenings. Sample went back to the boarding house and brushed his coat and checked his boots and was at the Consolidated's front door at 7:05. The main building was larger inside than its exterior suggested. The front room a working office with a counter and filing shelves, and the ordered evidence of an operation that kept its paperwork clean. And beyond it, through an open door, a back room that served as both Mabry's private office and, tonight, his dining room. A table set for two near the window. A lamp turned up against the March dark outside. Something from the kitchen that smelled like it had been working since mid-afternoon. Ira Mabry came around the desk with his hand out, and Sample shook it. He was broader than Sample had expected from other people's descriptions. Not fat, substantial, the build of a man who had done hard physical work for 20 years and had stopped doing it 5 years ago without losing what the work had put on him. His face was open and deeply lined, the lines of a man who spent his days outdoors even now, and his eyes were a pale blue that had seen enough winters to be equable about most things. He shook hands, the way he did everything else Sample had watched him do from a distance, with full attention, present to it, making the other person feel the attention was for them specifically. "I appreciate you coming," Mabry said. "I appreciate the invitation," Sample said, and meant neither of them. They sat. The food came from somewhere Sample didn't see, a door off the back of the room, a cook who materialized and retreated without speaking. The elk roast was what Bolin had promised, genuinely good, the kind of cooking that required patience and was its own argument for the cook's investment in the outcome. Sample ate, and Mabry ate, and they talked about the camp, the upper works, the spring thaw coming in another 6 weeks if the snowpack ran normal, the price of mercury for the amalgamation process which had gone up in the fall and hadn't come back down. Mabry talked about these things with the engaged interest of a man who found the operational details of running a mining camp genuinely absorbing, which Sample believed was true. He had built something here. The 32 workers on regular wages, the stamp mill running clean, the books that Rufus Cole described as straightforwardly maintained, these were Mabry's. Whatever else was true about Sierra Creek, the operation itself was his work and he knew it. "I understand you've been looking into Leland Fitch's disappearance," Mabry said. He said it after the first plates were cleared, in the tone of a man raising a subject he'd been meaning to raise and had waited until the right moment for. "Dewey asked me to," Sample said. Of course he did. Mabry refilled Sample's glass from the bottle between them, a decent whiskey better than saps. "Dewey's a loyal man. He and Leland were close. When something like this happens to someone close to you, you reach for explanations." He set the bottle down. "The mountains don't care about explanations. They take men and don't give reasons." "You've delivered that news before," Sample said. "I have." Something genuine came into his face, not performance, the memory of it. 3 men in 4 years on this operation. 2 before Leland. 1 in an equipment accident, 1 in a fall on the Upper Works Trail in winter. He held his glass. "I know what grief asks for. It asks for someone to blame. That's reasonable. It just isn't always possible to provide." Sample ate. "The marshal's office sent a deputy," Mabry said. "I know. The deputy found nothing because there was nothing to find." He said it without emphasis. "Leland went out alone in December and didn't come back. The territory north of our upper works is serious country. A man alone in that country in December, if something goes wrong, doesn't get a second opportunity." "What was he doing north of the upper works?" Sample said. A brief pause. "I don't know that he was." "You said the territory north of the upper works." Mabry looked at him with the pale blue eyes. "I said the territory in general. The north is the serious country." He picked up his glass. "I shouldn't have been that specific. I don't know where he went." "What was Leland doing the week before he disappeared?" "Working his claim, same as always." Mabry leaned back in his chair, a relaxed adjustment, comfortable with the question. "We saw him at the boundary a few times. Our East Bank crew works adjacent to his north stake. He was running his sluice later than usual into the evenings, which some men do when they're trying to get a few more days of yield before the winter freeze comes down hard. He looked at the window, the dark outside it. He was a hard worker. I respected him. We didn't agree on the business side of things, But that's separate from the man. The business side, Sample said. He didn't want to sell. Mabry said it as a fact, uncontested, without the coloring of a grievance. We made him several offers over 2 years. Fair offers. He said no, and he was entitled to say no, and I accepted that. He set his glass down. I'd still buy the claim. From Dewey, I mean. Dewey has standing now that Leland is gone. The offer I'd make him would be the same offer I made Leland, which was better than the land warrants. Why? Mabry looked at him directly. Because the east bank of that creek is adjacent to our operation, and we'd rather have clean boundaries than a neighbor with a grievance. It's that straightforward. He spread his hands briefly on the table, an open gesture. The claim has placer value, but it's not exceptional. We'd pay above market for the adjacency benefit. I'll tell Dewey, Sample said. I'd appreciate it. Mabry poured himself more whiskey. I don't expect he'll take it. But the offer should be on the table. Sample ate the last of the elk and set his fork down. The lamp between them on the table made a circle of yellow light that held their faces and left the edges of the room in gradients. The cook's door off the back was closed. Somewhere outside the building, the creek ran its night register lower than in the day, the meltwater easing back as the temperature dropped. Silas Greer, Sample said. The pale blue eyes held their arrangement. What moved in them, what Sample had been told would move in them, moved and lasted long enough to count and settled back into equability. Our Portland attorney, Mabry said, handles the incorporation filings, the regulatory correspondence, the land office work. Standard arrangement for an operation this size. He was up here in October. He comes twice a year. Mabry picked up his glass. Fall and spring. Reviews the books, makes sure everything is filed properly. He's thorough. And the investors he represents. Mabry looked at his whiskey. Portland money. A syndicate, I'm told. I don't know the individuals. That's how these arrangements work. The capital comes through the attorney, and the attorney manages the investor relationship. I manage the operation. You don't know who owns what you run. I know they pay on time, Mabry said, and there was something in it, not defiance, something shorter, the thing a man said when he had decided where his knowledge began and ended, and had made his peace with the boundary. I've been running operations since I was 22. I've worked for men I knew, and men I didn't, and the ones I didn't know were as reliable as the ones I did most of the time. He looked at Sample. You do your work for whoever hired you. I'd imagine you don't know everything about every person who sent you somewhere. I know enough, Sample said. Enough is what we have, Mabry said, and it landed as something more than a response to Sample's line. An inventory of what a man could claim. They finished the meal. The conversation moved back toward the operation, the spring plans, the East Bank extension Mabry had been designing for the thaw. He described it with the absorbed attention of a man who spent most of his waking hours thinking about extraction rates and equipment placement, the technical problem of getting what was in the mountain out of it efficiently. And Sample listened and understood that this was not performance. Mabry was genuinely interested in the problem of the operation because the operation was what he had. At 9 o'clock, Sample thanked him and took his coat from the hook by the door and put it on. The offer to Dewey, Mabry said, from behind his desk where he'd moved to look at something in the files. I'll tell him. I hope he considers it seriously. He looked up from the files. He's working that claim alone, and it's too much for one man. There's a point where holding something costs more than having it. Sample went out. The night was clear and cold. the stars doing their full work overhead, the mountains black against them on three sides of the camp. The creak was audible from the main building's porch, lower in the dark, the sound of it distinct without the day's other noise to compete against. 2 lamps burned in the camp, the saloons and one at the workers' quarters. He stood on the porch for a moment. Ira Mabry was not a man Sample had trouble reading. He was a man who had drawn a line around his own knowledge and had been standing inside that line for long enough that the line had started to feel like a wall. The warmth across the dinner table was not counterfeit. He did find Sample's presence inconvenient, and he did wish Sample would carry an offer to Dewey and this would resolve, but the warmth was also management, the instinctive adjustment of a man who had learned that problems handled early were easier than problems left to grow. The pause when Sample said Greer's name. Not guilt. Closer to the recognition of someone who had heard a door open on a room he kept closed. Mabry knew what the investors wanted. He had known since Bascom Reeves fell into the ravine, and the deputy came and went, and the Reeves claim went to the Consolidated for a number that Nora Reeves took because she had no other option. He had known when Leland Fitch heard the conversation at the North Stake, and went out the following week and didn't come back. He hadn't done either thing himself, that was true probably, but he had let the line he'd drawn around his knowledge function as permission. That was the compartment. Not ignorance. Permitted distance. Sample went down the porch steps and across the camp's central track toward Hassie's. The mud was frozen hard underfoot, the night temperature dropping fast with the clear sky, and his breath came white in the dark. He was thinking about the upper camp, and what happened there on Tuesdays and Fridays, and about Mabry saying the territory north of the upper works is serious country, and the correction he'd made to that, I don't know where he went, and what the correction meant for where Leland Fitch might actually be. A man who knew what was under the gravel bar and knew what was coming for him would go somewhere. He'd go somewhere he knew, somewhere in the country around the creek that he'd been working for 4 years and knew the way a man knew country he'd moved through in every season. He wouldn't go towards civilization, where the people who wanted to find him would be looking. He'd go deeper in. The north of the upper works was serious country. Mabry hadn't said that by accident. He'd caught himself saying it and pulled back, but the pull hadn't been fast enough. The boarding house lamp burned in the window. Inside the front room, sitting at the long table with his hands on the surface and a rolled document beside them, was Gideon Lease. Hassie was at the kitchen end of the room with her back turned, doing nothing in particular, which was her way of being present without being present. Sample came in and took his coat off and sat across from Lease. Lease looked at him. How was supper? He's a good cook. Mabry's a capable man, Lease said. He builds things that work. He runs a clean operation. He looked at the rolled document beside his hands. Those are the things that make what else he does harder to account for. He keeps his eyes at his own level, Sample said. Everything above it, he leaves to the people who put him here. That's a way of saying it. Lease looked at his hands. There's a night in November I've gone over more times than I can count. The night before Leland went. I was coming back from the North Fork Trail. I walk it to think. I've done it for 2 years, and I passed the back of the main building, and the lamp was on in the office. 2 voices inside. Mabry and a third voice I didn't recognize. He stopped. What did you hear? Enough to know they were talking about Leland. Enough to know the conversation had a conclusion to it. He picked up the rolled document and set it down again. Not enough to swear to in front of a judge. What would you swear to? That I heard Mabry say Leland's name. That the third voice said something about a timeline, and that Mabry didn't object to it. He looked at the document. That I went back to my bunk and lay there until morning, telling myself I hadn't heard what I heard. The lamp on the table between them burned without drama. Outside the window, the night held its clear cold, and the stars were tremendous over the mountains and entirely indifferent to any of it. I went to the North Stake the morning after Leland didn't come back, Lise said. The split in the log, I'd seen Leland use it before, once for a letter, once for some cash he was keeping separate from the cabin. I checked it. He put one hand on the rolled document. This was in it. Rolled in oilskin, the way a man stores something he needs to stay dry. Leland's copy of the Webb survey, Sample said. Signed by Webb, dated with his certification stamp. Lise pushed the document across the table, but kept 2 fingers on the edge of it. Before I give you this, tell me what you do when you find what you're going to find. Sample looked at the document. Aldous Webb's name at the bottom, the stamp of a certified Oregon Territory surveyor, the coordinates of the Fitch Claims Creek bed precisely measured, the depth to the hard rock cap at 12 survey points along the gravel bar, the estimated yield calculated by a man who had measured the deposit and had the credentials to know what his measurement meant. I don't know yet, Sample said. Lise looked at him. Anyone who told you different from that would be lying to you, Sample said. I know what I have. I know there's more I don't have. What I do with all of it depends on what all of it turns out to be, and I don't have all of it yet. He held Lisa's eyes. What I can tell you is what I won't do, which is take this document and Dewey Fitch's letter and the evidence of that ravine and put them in a letter to a territorial marshal's office that will send a deputy in 6 weeks. Lise held his 2 fingers on the edge of the document. The people running this operation have money and attorneys and time, Sample said. Beating that with less than the full picture gets you Bascom Reeves's result. I don't want Dewey to get that result, and I don't want you to get it, and I don't want Leland to get it if Leland is somewhere on that mountain still breathing. He kept his voice level, the same register he used for facts that needed to be said plain. So I need everything before I move. Not almost everything. Lise took his fingers off the document. What else is there? Sample said. The upper camp, Lise said. Whatever is up there is what ties all of it together. I don't know what it is. I know Bolin goes twice a week and comes back different both times, not drunk, not worked, just different in the way a man is different when he's done something he keeps separate from the rest of his life. He looked at Sample. And I know Noel went up there 2 weeks before Leland disappeared and came back and filed his shaft survey results under Mabry's preliminary data category and hasn't spoken a full sentence to anyone since. Sample picked up the Webb survey and held it. The paper had the weight of something that had been in a split log through an Oregon December, slightly dampened despite the oilskin, the edges softened, but the writing on it clean and the surveyor's stamp intact, Webb's signature as clear as the day he'd put it down. A man had paid for this document and hidden it against the day someone came for it, and had then gone somewhere in the country north of the upper works and had not come back. Mabry knows, Lise said. Yes. He didn't do it himself. No. Sample rolled the document back into its oilskin. He built a wall around what he knew, and called the wall his job and let other people stand on the other side of it. He looked at Lise. That's a kind of doing. Lise looked at the table surface. He was doing the accounting that Baptists did, Sample understood, running the moral ledger of where he'd stood and what he'd let happen and what he was doing now, and whether the now offset the then in any way that mattered. I kept the survey for 3 months, Lise said. That's its own kind of wall. You didn't know who to give it to. That's a reason. He looked up. It's not a full accounting. No, Sample said. But it's what you had. He stood and took the oilskin survey, and Lisa's eyes followed it. Stay at your work. Don't change anything. Don't let Mabry see you've changed anything. He picked up his hat. The upper camp. What's the best approach from below that isn't the main North Fork Trail? Lise looked at him. You're going up there. Not tonight. There's a fire road cut on the East Ridge. Logging access from when the Consolidated took timber off that side 2 years ago. It runs parallel to the North Fork Trail, about a quarter-mile east, rejoins the main track half a mile below the upper camp. He paused. It's rough going. Snow on the upper sections still. How rough? Manageable on foot, not on a horse. He held Sample's eyes. If someone is up there, you don't want to be seen going up. I don't intend to be seen, Sample said. He went upstairs and put the web survey with Leland's oilskin letter under the loose floorboard, the two documents together now, and came back down and found Hassie in the kitchen doorway. What time does Bolin come back from the upper camp? He said. Thursday morning, usually, she said. He goes up Tuesday and stays 2 nights. 2 nights. Whatever the upper camp was, it required 2 nights of Harv Bolin twice a week to run it. Sample stood in the boarding house kitchen with the mountain cold working its way under the door and thought about workforce management activities and a man with a laugh that didn't cost him anything and what those 2 things added up to when the full accounting was done. Tomorrow, he said. Wednesday, Hassie said. Bolin won't be back. Gear won't go to the Consolidated until Friday. She looked at him steadily. Nobody's watching tomorrow. That's what I thought, Sample said. He went to bed and slept without difficulty, which was a thing he'd learned to do, the body's insistence on its maintenance regardless of what the thinking was doing. And in the morning he'd go up the East Ridge Fire Road and find out what the upper camp was and whether Leland Fitch was somewhere in the country north of it. He'd know by Thursday what the full accounting looked like. Whether the accounting could be made to matter was the question he'd answer after. Chapter 5. The East Ridge Fire Road had been cut 2 years ago, and the mountain was already working to reclaim it, alder pushing through the wheel ruts, a windfall Douglas fir across the lower section that someone had bucked through once and left, and above the first switchback, where the logging access climbed past the point the timber crew had needed to reach, snow still 6 inches deep in the shadows between the stumps. Sample went up on foot in the early morning dark before the camp woke, the Spencer carbine across his back, moving without hurrying, because hurrying on icy footing in the dark produced the kind of result he was here to prevent for other people. The ridge above the fire road caught the first light an hour before the camp below did. He reached the junction where the fire road rejoined the North Fork Trail and stopped in the timber and read the trail in both directions. Fresh mule tracks going up, a day old. Boot prints beside them, one man's, the tread of a working boot with a worn outside heel. Bolin. He followed at a distance that kept the trail's next bend between them, which on this terrain meant close enough to hear the mule on the switchbacks above. The upper camp sat in a bench cut into the ridge's eastern face, a natural flat that the logging operation had found useful, and the Consolidated had expanded with a grading crew in '72. 4 structures, a bunkhouse, a supply shed, a cook shack, and a 4th building set apart from the others at the bench's eastern edge, built heavier than the rest, with a padlocked door and no windows on the sides Sample could see. The bench looked down into a secondary drainage that ran north, before turning east toward the valley, out of sight of the main creek and Sierra Creek's camp below. A corral at the bunkhouse end held 4 horses and a mule. One of the horses was gray, with a blaze running the full length of its face, white and clean against the gray coat. Sample stood in the timber above the bench and watched the camp for an hour. 2 men came out of the bunkhouse at first light, dressed for outdoor work, and went to the supply shed, and came out with tools, and crossed the bench to the drainage's edge, and went down a path that Sample could see for 30 yards before the slope took it out of sight. Off-ledger workers, Lise had suggested. Men doing work the Consolidated's books didn't cover. A third man came out of the bunkhouse later, and stood on the step and stretched, and went to the cook shack. He had the gray horse's ease with the camp, moving through it without checking anything, knowing where everything was, the bearing of someone who ran this place rather than worked in it. He was a large man. He wore a coat that was better than anything else visible at the camp, the cut of it Eastern-made. Sample watched him for 20 minutes. He went into the cook shack and came out with a tin cup and stood on the cook shack step and drank from it and looked down the secondary drainage toward where his 2 workers had gone, and his attention was proprietary, not worried about what they were doing, but aware of it the way a man was aware of equipment running correctly. He laughed once at something the cook said from inside, and the laugh came up the ridge to where Sample stood in the timber and had no weight to it, the laugh of a man who used it the way he used his coat, as presentation. Sample came down from the ridge the way he'd gone up, on the fire road, and was back in camp before the day shift change, and told Hassie he needed post-riders going 2 directions. He wrote the letters in Hassie's kitchen before breakfast, both of them short, because both of them needed to carry a great deal in few words, and he'd learned that the way to do that was to know exactly what he was asking before he started writing. To his federal contact in Portland, the one who owed him, the one close enough to telegraph a response, he wrote the name Sierra Creek Consolidated Mining Company, the name Silas Greer as its Portland attorney, and asked for the Oregon Territory Incorporation records and the name of whoever Greer had filed on behalf of. He wrote that the matter connected to a prior case, and that the connection, when documented, would be of interest to the federal marshal's office. To Walter Gann, in Columbus, he wrote the San Francisco hotel address from Hassie's misdirected letter and the initial CA, and asked whether the Abel family held any Portland, Oregon, San Francisco mining interests filed since November of 1873, and whether the name Pacific Meridian Holdings appeared in any of their known corporate structures. He addressed it to Gann's St. Louis office, which Gann had moved to when the case moved west, and added a postscript asking after Clara. Hassie took both letters and said she knew a rider going to the valley today, and the Portland Telegraph would have the first one by evening if the trail was clear. "Is it clear?" Sample said. "It was Tuesday," she said. "Nobody's gone up since." He ate breakfast and spent the morning at the Fitch claim with Dewey running the sluice, and told Dewey about Mabry's offer in the same tone he'd have used to report the weather, factual, uncolored, what was said, and what it meant, and what Dewey was entitled to decide about it. Dewey worked the rake through a load of gravel and let it settle in the sluice. "No," he said. "I told him I'd pass it along." "You passed it." He pulled the rake out and reset it. "No." Sample worked the sluice beside him for another hour and didn't raise the offer again. The road south left the camp on the creek's west bank and descended through second-growth timber into a wider valley where 3 smaller operations had claims on tributary drainages. 8 miles was 2 hours at an easy pace, and Sample rode it on the bay in the Thursday morning, the March air cold enough to keep his breath visible, but the sun above the eastern ridge now, and doing its slow work on the snowpack. The Sims place sat back from the road on a bench above the tributary, a modest house with a root cellar dug into the hillside behind it, and a wash operation visible below on the water, a long tom and a sluice box, the equipment of a man working at a manageable scale. A kitchen garden staked out beside the house, not yet planted, the stakes standing in rows through the late snow. 2 children's boots on the porch step, mismatched in size. Delbert Sims came to the door before Sample reached it, which told him Sims had been watching the road. He was a solid, quiet man of 40, with a face that had spent its life outdoors and had the color to show it. He looked at Sample with the careful attention of someone who had learned to assess strangers quickly and act on the assessment, not from suspicion, but from the earned caution of a man who had married a woman with a history and had taken on the obligation of protecting what that history had left her. "Mr. Sample," he said. Hassie had sent word ahead with the same rider who'd carried the letters. "She said you might come." "I won't take long," Sample said. "She'll decide that." Sims stepped back from the door. "She's in the kitchen." The house smelled like wood smoke and the morning's porridge, and the particular warm smell of a house where children had recently been and had gone off to school or chores, that residual energy. Nora Reeves, Nora Sims now, though Hassie had called her by her first name only, stood at the kitchen table with a dishcloth in her hands and did not come forward when Sample came in. She was 32 or 33, dark-haired, with the face of a woman who had made a series of decisions about what she was willing to carry and what she was not, and had drawn the lines between them carefully and held them. She was not hostile. She'd done her grieving and her anger and whatever else the years since the ravine had required of her. And what was left was a woman who had 2 children at school, and a decent man in the other room, and a kitchen she'd arranged to her own standards. And she did not want any part of what Sample represented to come through the door she'd closed on it. She saw him anyway. "Sit down," she said, and sat across from him at the table, and Delbert's footsteps went to the far room and were quiet there. "The night before your first husband went into the ravine," Sample said. "I know what you're here about. Tell me what you remember about the horse." She set the dishcloth down. "Gray. A hand taller than our horses. White blaze from the pole to the nose, straight and clean, not forked." She said it the way she'd said it before, to someone else, the words worn smooth by prior use. It was dusk. I was at the window. Bascom went out to the corral when he saw the rider come down the North Fork trail, and they stood together outside the fence for 20 minutes, maybe 30. You couldn't see the rider's face. The light was gone by then. I saw the horse. She folded her hands on the table. The horse was in Sierra Creek Camp's corral the next time I went up for supplies. I've seen it there every time since. You told the deputy who came. I told the first deputy. He wrote it down and asked me if I had any other reason to suspect foul play, and I said Bascom knew that ravine and wouldn't go off the edge of it in the dark, and the deputy said accidents happened and closed his notebook. She put her hands flat on the table. I sold the claim 6 weeks after they brought Bascom out. The Consolidated sent a man down with an offer, and I took it because the alternative was working a placer operation alone with 2 children and watching the Consolidated make my access road difficult and my equipment disappear and my applications for additional water rights get lost in the county filing system. They pressured you after Bascom died. They didn't do anything I could put a name on. My water rights application went into the county office and came out 6 weeks later with a notation that it required additional documentation. And when I submitted the documentation, it required more documentation. And when I had that, the man who handled the filings had been replaced, and the new man had no record of my prior submissions. She said it without heat, the recitation of a woman who had watched a system work against her until she understood the system and made the calculation it was designed to produce. I am not ashamed of what I decided. I had my children to think about. Nobody's asking you to be ashamed, Sample said. She looked at him directly. The deputy asked me, in the way men ask things without saying them, whether I was sure I was remembering the horse correctly. Whether grief made things seem more connected than they were. She folded the dishcloth into a square. I've thought about that horse every week for 2 years. I am not confused about what I saw. No, Sample said. I don't think you are. She rose and went to the window and looked at the tributary below, the Long Tom running in the March melt, Delbert's equipment doing its patient work without him, while he stayed in the far room and let his wife handle this herself. Is Bascom? She stopped. Started again. Is there something that can be done? I don't know yet, Sample said. What I have isn't a case. What you've told me is part of what a case needs. He stood. I'll tell you before I do anything with it. You have the right to decide whether your name is part of what goes forward. She turned from the window. My name is already part of it, she said. I told the deputy. It's in whatever record he made. She looked at him steadily. I don't care about my name. I care about whether it does anything. I'll make it do something, Sample said. She walked him to the door. On the porch, he picked up his hat, and she stood in the doorway with the dishcloth and looked past him at the road. Bascom was in the ravine, she said. That's where he is. That's where he's going to stay. She wasn't asking for anything. She was stating the geography of what she'd accepted. I'm sorry Leland Fitch is gone too. I'm sorry his brother is working that claim alone. She looked at Sample. I'm not sorry I sold. I am sorry Bascom is in the ravine. Sample went down the porch steps to his horse. The federal contact's response came Friday morning, which was faster than a letter had any right to travel, which meant he'd telegraphed as soon as he got Sample's letter, and the response had come back on the wire before the ink on Sample's letter was dry at the Portland office. Hassie brought the folded paper to where Sample sat at the long table before breakfast. Sierra Creek, Consolidated Mining Company, Oregon Territory Incorporation, filed November 1873 by Portland attorney Elias Drum on behalf of Pacific Meridian Holdings. Pacific Meridian Holdings Incorporated, California, October 1873, principals undisclosed per California filing law. Portland, attorney of record for Pacific Meridian, Elias Drum. Same attorney. The contact had written one additional line at the bottom of the telegram. Drum Incorporated, Bell and Associates, Portland, September 1872. Thought you'd want to know. Thought you'd want to know. $43,000 in a San Francisco hotel in January, and 6 months later Pacific Meridian Holdings in California, and 2 months after that, Elias Drum filing the Sierra Creek Consolidated's Oregon Territory papers. The money finding its next shape in the time it took a man to cross from Oregon to California and identify the next instrument and set it up behind the same layers of corporate distance. Sample folded the telegram and put it in his coat. Gahn's response came Friday evening, a letter rather than a telegram, which meant it had been in transit since before Sample's letter reached him. Gahn had already pulled the thread and was following it on his own. His St. Louis office had obtained California Incorporation records through a correspondent attorney, and Pacific Meridian Holdings appeared in those records with one traceable feature. Its registered agent in California was a firm called the Market Street Trust Company, which had served as registered agent for 4 other entities in the previous 2 years, 2 of which had been connected by a San Francisco court to a land investment operation that had collapsed under fraud allegations in 1871. The 1871 operation's principal investor, unnamed in the court records, but identified in a newspaper account Gann had enclosed, had been a Columbus, Ohio businessman who had settled the fraud claims out of court and relocated to California. The newspaper account did not name the businessman. The date on it was April 1872. The Abel family had been doing this longer than Oregon. Sample was at the table when Lease came to the boarding house before dawn on Saturday. He came the way he came, when he was carrying something he hadn't chosen to be carrying. Without his usual composure, the North Fork Trail's quiet exchanged for the directness of a man who had been up all night with information and had nowhere to put it. He sat across from Sample. "Noel," he said. "When?" He was at the bunkhouse at supper. He wasn't there when the night shift crew came in at 10. Lease set his hands on the table. His satchel is gone. The leather one he carries the rolled surveys in. He paused. His horse is still in the corral. A man who packed his professional documents and left his horse. He ran, Sample said. On foot in the dark. Or someone took the satchel and left the horse to make it look like he ran. Lease kept his voice flat, the delivery of facts he did not want to be delivering. Mabry has 2 men out since midnight. He told the bunkhouse they were doing a welfare check, making sure Noel didn't fall on the trail. Does Mabry believe that? No, Lease said. He doesn't. The pre-dawn dark held the camp outside, and the boarding house lamp made its circle on the table between them. And Hassie had come to the kitchen doorway in her robe and stood there, and neither of them told her to go back to bed because she would not have gone. The satchel, Sample said. What was in it besides his survey tools? Lease was quiet for a moment. He'd been doing the shaft surveys every Thursday for 6 weeks. The results he filed as preliminary data. He put both hands flat on the table. But he kept copies. He told me 3 weeks ago, when he was still talking to people. Said he kept copies of everything, because a surveyor's reputation was his survey record, and he wasn't going to let anyone's filing system be the only record of his work. He paused. The copies would be in the satchel. The West Bank shaft surveys showing the fault line. The discrepancy between what the Portland geologist had projected and what Noel had actually found at depth. What that discrepancy meant for the Consolidated's extraction plan. What it meant for the argument that the Fitch claims East Bank access was necessary rather than merely convenient. Noel had the document that made the case for why the Fitch claim had to be acquired, and the document that showed the Consolidated had known it for months, and the document that showed the acquisition hadn't been done through legitimate offer and acceptance, but through the removal of anyone who said no. If he ran, Sample said, he's on the back trail in the dark with a broken leg waiting to happen, or he made it to the Valley Road. He rose from the table. If he didn't run, he's somewhere between here and the upper camp. Lease looked at him. You went up there. Wednesday. Then you know about the gray horse. Yes. Lease was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sky above the eastern ridge had begun its first imperceptible lightening, the darkness going from black to the dark blue that preceded anything visible. What do we do? He said. Sample took his coat from the hook. You go to your shift. You work your crew. You don't tell anyone you were here, and you don't ask about Noel beyond what the bunkhouse is already asking. He put the coat on. I'm going to find Noel before Mabry's men do. You don't know which direction he went. I know where he wouldn't go, Sample said. He wouldn't go up. He knows what's up there. Hassie said from the kitchen doorway. The Valley Road branches 3 miles south of camp. Left fork goes to the telegraph station at Riddle Creek. Right fork goes down to the main Valley Road. She had been listening from the doorway through all of it, and had the information ready, because Hassie Prout had the information ready for whatever the situation required. A man running would go to the telegraph. Why the telegraph? Lee said. Because a man with documents and nowhere to go needs to tell someone what he has before someone takes it from him, Hassie said. She looked at Sample. Take the left fork. Sample went out into the pre-dawn cold of the camp and untied the bay from the shed rail and mounted and rode south on the creek path. And above him the eastern ridge caught the first light, and the mountains stood white against the sky that was going from dark blue to something lighter. And somewhere ahead of him on the south trail a surveyor with a leather satchel was either running or had been stopped. Either way, Sample needed to be there before Mabry's men. Chapter 6. The left fork ran south and east, climbing away from the creek drainage toward the telegraph station at Riddle Creek. And Sample pushed the bay up it in the gray light before dawn, with the cold working through his coat at the collar, and the trail still frozen hard enough to give the horse good footing. The mountains above were black against a sky going slowly lighter, the snowpack up high catching what little light there was, and holding it in a faint blue-white that made the ridges visible before anything below them was. He'd gone 2 miles when he heard it. Not a voice. A sound between a voice and something else, coming from the east side of the trail where the ridge dropped away into a secondary gully, the kind of sound a man made when he'd been making it for a while and had stopped expecting anyone to hear it. Sample pulled the bay up and listened. Again. Directional, maybe 40 yards off the trail into the timber and below it, where the gully's edge would be. He tied the bay to a branch and went into the timber on foot, moving down the slope through the snow with a hand on each tree he passed, reading the ground before he waded it. The gully dropped off fast once it started. Not the gradual slope of the trail's descent, but a genuine break in the terrain, the kind that appeared without warning from above and looked manageable from below and was neither from the middle. Noel was on a ledge 8 feet down the gully's near wall, sitting with his back against the rock face and his right leg extended in front of him at an angle that legs did not take without cause. He'd made it to the ledge somehow from the gully floor below, crawled up the broken rock face, Sample guessed, with one leg that worked and one that didn't, and had been on the ledge since then. He looked up when Sample appeared at the gully's rim. "Sample," he said, the way a man said a name when it was the answer to a question he'd been asking the dark for hours. "Can you move the leg?" "No." "Is it the bone or the joint?" "Bone." "I heard it." He had his coat pulled over the leg and his surveyor's satchel under his head as a pillow, the leather dark with the cold and the damp of the ledge. "I went off the switchback on the ridge trail. I was running and the ice," he stopped. "I've been here since midnight." "The ridge trail goes up," Sample said. "You went up." "I know what's on the valley trail." He looked at his leg. "I thought I could get over the ridge and down the other side to the Riddle Creek Road. In the dark. In March." "I was running," Noel said again, and this time the word carried everything it had in it. Not the speed of the thing, but the state of a man who had been frightened for weeks and had finally broken into movement regardless of whether the movement made sense. Sample went back to the bay and untied the bedroll and brought it down to the ledge, working his way down the broken rock face with care that Noel had not had the luxury of taking. He got the bedroll around Noel's shoulders and sat beside him on the ledge and looked at the leg. The fracture was below the knee, the lower leg deviating where it had no reason to deviate. Not compound. A bad fracture, the kind that needed setting and splinting and rest, not the kind that killed a man who got off a cold ledge and into warmth within the next few hours. "I'm going to get you down to the trail," Sample said. "It's going to take a while, and it's going to cost you." "All right," Noel said. It took 40 minutes and cost Noel considerably, and he bore it without making more sound than the situation required, which Sample respected. They went down the broken rock face with Noel's arm across Sample's shoulders and Sample's hand at Noel's belt and the bad leg trailing. And at the bottom of the gully they crossed to where the ground rose more gradually and worked up through the snow to the trail. And Sample sat Noel against a tree and went for the bay and brought it back and got Noel onto it sideways with the fractured leg hanging free. He led the horse south, walking. "Tell me about Leland Fitch," Sample said. Noel was quiet for a moment, the pain of the leg in his face and the cold and the long night, but present enough, the eyes tracking. "He's alive," he said. "He's in a trapper's cabin 12 miles northeast of camp, on the far side of the ridge, above the Umpqua drainage." Sample kept walking. "Lease warned him," Noel said. Lease overheard enough of a conversation in November to know what was being planned, and went to Leland and told him he had days, not weeks. Leland packed his survey documents and went into the mountains. He shifted on the horse, adjusting the leg. He came to me in January, came down from the cabin at night, and found me at the East Bank equipment before the morning shift. He needed someone on the inside to know he was alive. He paused. He chose me because he'd seen me filing the preliminary data, and he thought a man who kept records he was told to hide was a man who still had some accounting to do. You were the middleman. I carried messages. Between Leland and Dewey, and between Leland and— he stopped. "There's an attorney in Portland." Not Drum. Someone Leland found independently before he went. He's been building a case from the cabin. How? Letters. I carried them out on my survey trips to the county office and mailed them from there. He told me what to look for in the shaft surveys, the fault line, the depth discrepancy, the numbers that didn't match the Portland geologist's projections. Noel looked at the trail ahead. I didn't go looking for what I found in those shafts. But I found it, and I kept records because that's what I do. I kept records, and Leland knew what they meant. And Mabry found out about you. Someone told him. I don't know who. He looked at his hands on the saddle. He came to me Thursday evening. He was the way he gets when something needs handling. Not angry. Focused. He shifted it again. He said, "Noel, I need to know what you've been doing with your off-ledger copies of the survey data." He said it like he already knew the answer and was giving me a chance to tell him myself. "What did you say?" I said I didn't know what he meant. And he looked at me the way a man looks at you when he knows you're lying and has decided to let you keep doing it for the time being. Noel held the saddle with both hands as the bay navigated a rough section of trail. I went back to the bunkhouse and packed my satchel and went out the back at 9 o'clock. Why the ridge trail? Because Mabry had 2 men watching the valley trail by then. I could see their lamp from the bunkhouse window. He looked at the trail behind them, the morning coming up now, the light reaching the lower elevations. I should have waited. I panicked. You ran when you needed to run, Sample said. The leg is an argument about route, not timing. Noel said nothing for a moment. Leland's Portland attorney. His name is Hiram Alt. He has everything Leland sent him over the past 3 months. Leland's own notes, the letters from me about the shaft discrepancy, a statement Nora Reeves gave through the attorney about the night before Bascom died. He paused. He's been waiting for someone to come out of that camp with physical documents rather than mailed accounts. Noel's satchel, Sample said mostly to himself. Yes. The formal shaft surveys with my certification. The Portland geologist's projections for comparison. Signed, dated, stamped. He reached down and put a hand on the satchel strap where it crossed the saddle in front of him. The geologist's projections show the fault line doesn't exist. My surveys show it does. The geologist filed his report in '72, before anyone had sunk a shaft deep enough to find the fault. He looked at Sample. The Consolidated's expansion plan depends on the geologist's projections being accurate. If they're not, the East Bank access isn't the most efficient approach. It's the only one. And they've known that since your surveys. Mabry has known it since October. He sent the geologist's report to Portland immediately after, and I never saw a response, which is its own answer. He gripped the saddle as the trail dipped. The survey results I filed as preliminary data. Mabry told me that was standard procedure for results requiring confirmation. He said the Portland office would follow up. He looked ahead. Nobody followed up. The camp appeared below them as the trail rounded the last bend above the creek drainage. The stamp mill visible first, then the structures along the water, the morning shift beginning its business. Smoke from the cook shack, men moving on the east bank. The scene of an operation running on its established schedule. 40 people doing the work they were paid to do, most of them knowing nothing about the lines drawn above their pay grade. Sample brought Noel into camp at the boarding house end, and Hassie was at the door before they reached it. He sent Lise for Dewey Fitch inside the hour. He found Lise at the East Bank equipment and told him where Leland was and said go get Dewey and bring him to the boarding house, and then take Dewey toward the Umpqua drainage and find the cabin. And Lise listened and went without questions, the movement of a man who had been carrying what he knew for months and was now putting it down by picking it up. He sent a rider to Salem before noon with a letter to the territorial marshal's office, not because he expected them quickly, but because the record of a formal request mattered more than the request's speed, and because Hiram Alt in Portland would want to know the marshal had been notified through proper channels before anything else happened. He wrote to Alt directly that afternoon, through Hassie's post rider going to the valley, and told him what he had: Noel's physical surveys, the Webb survey from the split log, the Breen ledger from Book 2's precedent running through his mind as he listed what documentation existed and what it demonstrated. He told Alt about Nora Reeves, and that she'd given testimony to him directly, and would do so again under oath if asked in the right jurisdiction. He told him Gann in St. Louis had the able correspondence and the Pacific Meridian Incorporation connection, and that a federal judge in Oregon City named Pease had a prior inquiry record establishing the same family's pattern of land fraud. Then he went and sat with Noel, whose leg Hassie had splinted with the confidence of a woman who had done it before and expected to do it again, and drank the coffee Hassie brought without being asked, and told Noel about the gray horse in the upper camp's corral. Noel looked at his splinted leg. I knew about the horse, he said. I didn't know what it meant. You knew what it meant, Sample said. Noel held the coffee cup. I told myself it was above my level. Mabry's line, Sample said. Yes. He looked at the window. I drew it the same place he did. But you kept the records. I kept the records. He turned the cup. I don't know what that's worth. Ask Leland Fitch, Sample said. When you see him. Dewey came back to camp alone at dusk. He came down the North Fork Trail and through the camp without stopping, and stood in the boarding house doorway with mud on his boots and his eyes doing something they hadn't done in the weeks Sample had known him, which was rest. Sample was at the table. He's all right, Dewey said. I know. He's thin. He's been in that cabin since December. He came in and sat and put his hands on the table and looked at them. He said Lise came to him one night and sat with him in the cabin, and they talked about what to do, and Lease said the claim was his, and to hold it, and he'd find the right person eventually. He looked up. He said Lease walked 12 miles each way in the dark to tell him that. Lease is a man who pays his debts, Sample said. Dewey put his hands in his lap. Leland's coming down tomorrow. He needs a few days on the cabin's provisions first. He's been careful about the food and he has enough, but he wants to come down strong, not weak. He paused. He's got a letter for Alt that he's been writing for 3 weeks. He said it covers everything. Everything helps, Sample said. Dewey looked at the table. The offer Mabry sent through you. The one I said no to. What about it? I said no before I knew Leland was alive. I'd say no after 2. He looked up. But I want you to understand that I know what I'm holding. I know what they're going to do in the courts, and through the attorneys, and however else they manage things above my level. He said it without bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of a man counting what was ahead of him. I know it may not come out right. It may not, Sample said. But we're going to make them work for it. Yes, Sample said. You are. Mabry came in the morning. He came up the creek path with 2 men behind him, and stopped in front of the boarding house with his hat on, and his coat buttoned against the cold, and his hands at his sides, the posture of a man who had made a decision and was executing it. And Sample came out the front door and stood on the step and looked at him. The morning was clear and very cold, the kind of March cold that arrived without warning after a week of melt and set everything back, the mud frozen again, the air thin and sharp with it. The mountains on all 3 sides of the camp stood in their full March height above the drainage, snow to the tree line, white above that, the sky above the white a blue so deep it looked almost purple at the zenith. Mr. Sample, Mabry said. Mabry. Arvid Knoll left this operation with proprietary documents belonging to Sierra Creek Consolidated. He said it evenly, the prepared version of a thing prepared carefully. Those documents are the company's survey records, produced on company time with company equipment. They belong to the Consolidated, and I'd like them returned. Knoll is a material witness in a matter I've referred to the Territorial Marshal's office in Salem, Sample said. The documents in his satchel are evidence in that referral. Removing them from his custody would be obstruction of a pending official inquiry. Mabry looked at him. He had the pale eyes and the deeply lined face and the open manner he brought to everything. And underneath the manner he was running a calculation, which Sample could see in the slight narrowing at the corners of the eyes and the way his breathing had slowed. You've notified the marshal's office. Yesterday. By rider. Sample held his eyes. Hiram Alt in Portland has been notified as well. He's been building the case for 3 months. What Knoll carried out of this camp is the last piece of physical documentation Alt needed. One of the 2 men behind Mabry shifted his weight. The other looked at a point somewhere past Sample's left shoulder, not meeting his eyes, and Sample tracked this without moving his head, the look of a man finding reasons not to commit to what the next moment might require. Gideon Lease was at the corner of the assay office building, 20 yards to Mabry's left and slightly behind him, standing with his arms at his sides in the cold morning air. He had come there without being asked to, which told Sample something about what Lease had decided about himself, and he stood there without doing anything except being present and visible to Sample and invisible to Mabry, and his visibility to Sample was the point. Mabry's 2 men had seen Lease. Their arithmetic included him. The Territorial Marshal's office, Mabry said. He said it the way a man said something he needed to hear out loud before he could fully believe it was the situation. On what basis? The disappearance of Leland Fitch. The death of Bascom Reeves. The conduct of a land acquisition operation that has removed legitimate claimants from their properties through means that go beyond what any legal instrument covers. Sample looked at him steadily. I have survey documentation showing the hard rock deposit under the Fitch claim in the Consolidated's internal surveys showing they've known about it for 18 months. I have testimony from Nora Reeves about the night before her husband died. I have the names of the attorneys who incorporated the Consolidated's parent company in California and their prior relationship to another fraud operation in Oregon Territory. Mabry was very still. The people who put you here are in San Francisco and Portland, Sample said. The man in San Francisco has $43,000 and a new corporate name and attorneys in 3 cities. None of what happened this morning reaches him. He kept his voice at the register of facts delivered to someone who needed to hear them. But you're on a mountainside in March with 2 men and a legal argument. And what the argument covers and what it doesn't cover are 2 different things. And I think you know which side of that line this morning is on. One of Mabry's men said low, Ira. Mabry looked at Sample for a long moment. The open face held its arrangement, and behind it the calculation ran out to wherever it ran out, and delivered whatever it delivered. And what it delivered was visible in the way his shoulders settled, a degree's worth of adjustment downward, the posture of a man whose body had already decided before his mouth did. The case you're building, Mabry said. It's going to take years. Yes. It may not produce anything. It may not, Sample said. That's not the same as not building it. Mabry looked at his hands, then at the boarding house door, then at the mountains above the camp, the white of them against the blue sky, enormous, and entirely without opinion about what happened at their feet. He turned and walked up the creek path toward the Consolidated's main building, and his 2 men turned with him, and the 3 of them went without looking back, and the camp's morning sounds filled in behind them as though nothing had interrupted them. Lease walked over from the assay office corner. That's all, he said. For this morning, Sample said. The territorial marshal arrived from Salem 4 days later with a deputy and a notebook, and the manner of a man who had read his instructions carefully and understood their limits. He took statements from Noel, whose leg had been properly set by then, and who spoke for 3 hours in Hassie's front room with Hiram Alt's written questions in front of him as a guide. From Lease, whose statement covered what he'd witnessed and what he'd carried and nothing he couldn't swear to. From Sample, whose statement was brief and pointed, and covered the documentation chain from Hassie's misdirected letter to the Federal Incorporation records to Nora Reeves's testimony to the web survey to Noel's shaft surveys. Leland Fitch came down from the mountain on the 3rd day. Sample saw him arrive at the creek path from the boarding house window, thin, as Dewey had said, moving with the stiffness of someone who had spent 3 months in a line cabin in an Oregon winter, but moving the Fitch walk that Dewey had and that Leland apparently also had, the forward-leaning purpose of men who had been working the land since they could work. Dewey met him at the path's end, and they stood together for a moment and did nothing dramatic because neither of them was built for drama, and then they went up to the claim cabin together. Sample didn't go. The marshal, after 3 days of statements and documentation review, told Sample what Sample had known he'd tell him, which was that the available evidence established a pattern of conduct consistent with fraud and potentially with more serious charges, but that bringing charges required a grand jury in the appropriate jurisdiction, and that the appropriate jurisdiction for conduct originating in California and executed through an Oregon corporation was a question the federal courts would need to resolve before anyone could say where the case would be heard or when. He said it apologetically, which was not his fault. "Gan in St. Louis," Sample said. "His contact information is in Noel's statement. He has the California incorporation records and the prior fraud connection. Tell him what you told me, and tell him Hiram Alt in Portland has 3 months of Leland Fitch's letters." The marshal wrote it down. "One more thing," Sample said. "The upper camp on the North Fork. 4 miles up. There's a man there with a gray horse and a city coat, and he's been running the enforcement side of this operation. He needs to be identified before he's gone." The marshal wrote that down too. Whether anything came of it before the man and the horse were gone was out of Sample's hands, and had been since before he rode into the drainage. He found Dewey at the claim on the morning of the 5th day. Leland was in the water, running the sluice with the focused energy of a man who had been away from his work for months and had things to make up to the creek. He was thinner than the sluice work called for, but doing it anyway, the determination of someone who had decided that the work was the answer to most of what the winter had asked of him. Sample stood at the bank with Dewey. "3 things," Sample said. He handed Dewey the Webb survey, the oilskin intact, Aldous Webb's signature clean inside it. 1. The formal survey from Webb, get it to Alt. He needs the original with the certification stamp, not a copy." He handed him a second document, Noel's shaft surveys, a copy Noel had made for the purpose. 2. The Consolidated's own data, showing the fault line and what it means for the East Bank access. Alt has context for it. 3. He said Walter Gaughan's name and Gaughan's St. Louis address, and watched Dewey repeat them back. The careful repetition of a man committing something to a memory he intended to keep. "Gan handles cases with this shape," Sample said. "He's patient, and he's thorough, and he's been tracking the operation behind this one for 2 years. He'll know what to do with what you give him." Dewey held the documents against his chest and looked at his brother in the water. "Will it be enough?" "I don't know," Sample said. "It's everything there is." He left Lease at his work, which was where he'd found him and where he was suited to be. He stopped at the East Bank equipment at the shift change, and Lease looked at him, and Sample gave him a nod that covered what there was between them, which was considerable, and Lease gave it back, and that was the accounting. He paid Hassie at the front desk, a month's rate and 7 days more in coin counted out. She took it, without counting it. "The other 2 men," she said. "The Pinkerton and the deputy. They left without saying anything." "I know. You're the 3rd man Dewey sent for." She put the coins in her apron pocket. "And the last one he'll need to." Sample put his hat on. "How long have you been in this camp?" "Since the 1st season," she said. "Longer than the mountain expected anyone to stay." "It's a good boarding house," Sample said. She looked at him. "Get some sleep on your way down," she said. "You look like a man who's been working." He went out and got the bay from the shed and packed his saddlebags and tied the bedroll and brought the horse around to the front. The camp was fully awake around him, the stamp mill at its day register, the East Bank crew visible through the equipment shed, the assay office open with Rufus Cole's lamp burning inside it despite the morning sun. He rode south on the creek path and took the valley trail at the junction and came down out of the Cascades through the morning, the mountains rising behind him as he descended, the drainage giving way to the secondary valley, and the secondary valley to the main valley road, and the road widening, and the timber changing from the high elevation fir to the lower elevation mix, and the air going from thin and cold to something with more moisture in it. Oregon air doing what Oregon air did when you came down from altitude, which was arrive all at once. He rode west. The cascades held their white above and behind him, enormous in the way they were always enormous. The snowpack going nowhere for another month. The passes through them open now but narrowly, the way through them requiring attention and competence, and the kind of patience that was not passive but active, the patience of someone moving carefully through a thing that could close on them. He had not resolved what he'd come to resolve. He had moved it forward. Leland Fitch was alive, and on his creek with his brother, and the documentation that a Portland attorney was building a case around. And Gideon Lease had his testimony ready and his professional ethic intact, and Hassie Prout had her boarding house and her memory, and 4 months of what she'd seen filed in the organized way she kept everything. The case would proceed at the pace of federal courts in 3 jurisdictions, and the opposition of attorneys funded by a man in a San Francisco hotel who had done this before and knew how long it took and what it cost, and had decided the cost was acceptable against the yield. That man had a new name now. He had a new corporate structure and new attorneys and the specific patience of someone who had been stopped once and had recalibrated and continued. And Sample was the reason he'd had to recalibrate. And the man knew that. And both of them understood what it meant for what came next. What came next was somewhere west. The valley road opened into the Willamette's broad reach in the late afternoon. The valley doing its green and gray March thing, rain moving in from the coast, the light going silver under the clouds coming off the Pacific. Somewhere south of him, along that valley, Pell was fitting a window sash, and Sierra Creedmoor was working timber on a North 40 that belonged to him because of what had been built in Oregon City in the winter, and Calhoun Doss was waiting on a federal court that moved at its own pace, and Gann was in St. Louis with a dossier that kept getting thicker. Sample rode into it. The mountains behind him held their cold and their white, and the camp at Sierra Creek running its stamp mill against the ridge, and the North Fork Trail going up through the timber to a bench where a gray horse lived in a corral. And the man with the laugh that cost nothing had either gone or was still there. And either way there was a record now. And the record was the thing that outlasted the moment. He had nowhere to be yet. The road west took him through the valley's edge, and he let the bay set the pace, which was easy and ground covering. And the rain came in off the coast and found him on the road, and he turned his collar up and kept going, which was the thing he did when he didn't know the next destination. He kept the direction and waited for the destination to announce itself, the way it always had. Someone with a letter or a name or a situation that needed the kind of help that arrived on a horse on a valley road in the rain. West had limits. He was approaching them. East had the mountains he'd just come down, and behind them the country that kept going past where he'd been, and the man in San Francisco rebuilding, and somewhere in the federal court system a warrant with Calhoun Doss's name on it working through its challenge, and all of it moving whether Sample moved or not. The rain came down through the silver light, and the valley road ran ahead under it, and the bay covered it at its own chosen pace, and Sample rode and didn't think about where he was going, and thought about it, and let the two things exist together the way they always did when he was between things, the not thinking and the thinking, the moving and the waiting to see what the moving produced. Something would need him. It always did. The end.